Now we're going to take a look at layer B, which is our synth layer. Again, we have our default preset. I'll just quickly turn off the sample for now, so we're just working with the synthesizer. And there's a lot of similarities between the two. However, obviously the engine is going to be different with how we make our sound. Like layer A, we have two sides that we can shift around if we want to, just by clicking and dragging to move them into either slots. And of course, enabling or disabling, you see by color or grayed out to have either one available. We'll just focus on one of them for now to see all of the different controls in here, but it works the same for both Synth 1 and 2. It's just two instances of it, both going into a shared filter down here. But like the sample, if we click up here, we can choose between the different types of synthesis that we'll be using to make our sound. So for separate engines, we'll start with the analog for now. You see we have a number of different presets basically to choose from with different settings for these sounds coming through. We can just select one of them for the moment, and basically we just have a bunch of settings laid out for what this synthesizer is doing. For the analog synth, when you choose that in the analog section, we have 3 oscillators. Currently this preset is mostly just using the noise, so there's not really anything other than that coming through, but we'll scroll down and get the default, which is just the basic sound, currently a saw wave. But with oscillators 1, 2, and 3, you can change their shape. Oscillator 1 is currently just alone, but we can turn up oscillator 2 with it. Or 3, we'll put it to a square wave so that they're different from each other. And then there's a noise as well. And those elements make up the basic sound. You then have an FM or frequency modulation that you can add to the sound specifically for oscillators 1 and 2, not for 3. So if it's just 3, we're hearing that frequency modulation on oscillator 1, but not oscillator 3. Whereas with 2 in there, both oscillators are getting the frequency modulation. But fairly straightforward analog synth controls for those oscillators, nothing but really the basics there. Then you can detune your unison voices, so that can thicken out a sound, especially with a bunch of saw waves. You can kind of get the super saw sort of sound. Default at 3 with some detuning, but we'll just set it back down to 0. But then we have the coarse tuning, which just as the layer A is just a semitone offset and a fine tune, same thing. And finally on the right, a volume that you can adjust for that layer. We then have a familiar envelope that works with the amplitude or the volume of the synth coming through. Obviously the same attack, decay, sustain, release that we've seen so far. You can link your attack and decay just as before. Change your curves, time multiplier, and link it to the velocity if you'd like. And really those are the controls that you're working with for your analog synths, cycling through the different presets. Similar to how you cycled through samples in the sampler, you just basically have different settings and different waves that are going through that analog engine. We'll then look at the granular engine, which in a similar fashion, this actually is going to use samples. However, instead of playing through in the way that layer A does, this uses granular synthesis to basically play little grains of the sound. You'll see that by the position of the line here, you'll get an idea of what is happening. So if you play a key, each of those little lines is a representation of what you're hearing in the sample. So picking a sound and moving that start position, especially if you get some of these interesting samples, of which there are plenty to choose from. As you click through the arrows and find anything in here, some of them are just noises that you can use to augment your other string layer. And then there are also string-like samples that you can pick in. Some of them even having several layers that you can pick from within that. There's other controls that we have. Your density is going to be how many grains are created. So turning that down to 1 hertz, for instance, is going to be 1 cycle per second. So every second we're getting another grain, but if we turn that up, obviously, we have however many hertz when it is set that way, but you can also set it to be synced to your tempo of the host DAW or the standalone tempo by different rhythms there. If you want to go in a tempo synced way, you then have size, which is the size or length of each grain. Turning that down, you get shorter grains. and longer they play through longer of the sample. And that can also be a time or synced value, as well as a ratio, which is a division of the current density value calculated for the grain. Your envelope shape basically refers to the shape of your grain, so you can make it smoother or clickier depending on how fast or slow you want that to be. Then under that, we have the same coarse, fine, and volume that we can adjust, as we've seen several times. Now moving into the harmonic engine, like before, plenty of different presets to choose from. This, however, works with an additive synthesis engine, essentially just making harmonics of the note you're playing to build up a sound, and that's essentially how sound works, but traditional synthesizers will usually use a subtractive method, though for our purposes here, things are pretty simple and we don't have to worry too much about the technicality of all of it. So each of our presets for the harmonics can be different spectrums that it will choose from. You'll see that the morph can go between spectrum A and B, depending on what your spectrums are loaded into the preset. FM, you have a similar frequency modulation, which you can hear the basic idea of FM synthesis, which is essentially just modulating your frequency or pitch up and down. At higher values, you hear different amounts of that for different sounds. Your section will be a window for spectral filters to apply themselves, so moving that around, you'll get differences in how everything is working with your other spectral settings. Then you have parity, which is your proportion of odd and even number harmonics, so you can get a more square or saw-like sound. And for more complex sounds like this, you basically just are changing the flavor of how it's going through. You have your same coarse, fine, and volume, but you also have on the left side a partials selection, and this is just the amount of harmonics that are really going to be played. So at 21.9, you'll get all your spectrum, but as you go down, you're basically cutting off your harmonics at the top. So it works like a low-pass filter. However, it's actually just stopping the harmonics that are playing as opposed to filtering them off. That's our harmonic engine, though. We're now going to look at the wavetable. And this is kind of similar, however, it's using wavetables to create morphing sounds. And this is a three-dimensional view. You can look at the two-dimensional view of what a wavetable is doing, but essentially you're just changing the wave that is being repeated at a frequency, therefore getting different sounds. So if you change your position, you hear the differences. Same thing here. In 2D, you can look at that. This also has an FM or frequency modulation. You can see it working there. In 2D, that doesn't show up in the 3D though. But you additionally have phase distortion and wave folding. So each of those are different ways to distort or manipulate the wave coming through the wavetable, but you can get a lot of movement in your sound with that evolving wave. You have detuning for your unison again. Coarse and fine tuning, as well as volume, as we've seen several times already. And again, as with the strings, you can do your filter, add a filter envelope, some resonance on there, or any of the other filters that you might want to apply to your sound to get different versions of it. Adjust your filter envelope or the amplitude envelope of your sound to create whatever it is you need to augment the string sample that's played in layer A. Although you could make a sound completely just using the synthesizers of layer B as well, because it can do quite a bit and you can layer two sounds together. You may want them to be the same pitch, but of course you can try whatever you want to try to create something in the way that you want to create it. Those are the basics of your sound generation in the advanced panel, and doing all of these different things is never really too complicated. There are somewhat limited controls on your synthesizer engines compared to full purpose-built synthesizers like Pigments by Arturia, but you get functioning versions of the engines within there, as well as your string samples to work with, so that you can get your augmented strings in this instrument. With that, we're now ready to move into modulation in the next video, so I will see you then.